Hi there, I'm Jim.
And I'm Claire.
Let's talk teaching. Welcome to Let's Talk Teaching, a podcast from the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology here at Illinois State University. I'm Jim G. Returning to our podcast today, Dr. Claire LaMonica, our director. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Jim.
How are you?
I'm so happy to be here doing this again.
It's been about a month. It's been a very busy month around here at CTLT. We've had spring break. We've had our spring institute. What else has been going on? We've had upgraded.
Getting ready for summer.
We're getting ready. Well, we are getting ready for summer.
Upgrade to ReggieNet.
Yeah.
All kinds of stuff. We've been a hop in place.
We have been. And, you know, when we as faculty members or as instructors get busy, segue coming up here, segue warning, when we get busy, it is sometimes hard for us to keep up with kind of our commitment to students to give them prompt feedback. So we want to talk today about prompt feedback, one of the 7 principles for good practice in undergraduate education.
It is indeed. And I think that the subtitle of today's episode should be Do As I Say, Not As I Do. This is like, I have to say, I work very, very hard at giving students prompt feedback, but it does not come naturally to me. I am not a sit down and get this done kind of person. And I have a mentor and many, many colleagues who just cannot rest until those student papers have been addressed. And that is so not me. So the good news is I get it and I understand why it's important, and that provides me with some impetus to get after it and get it done in a timely fashion. If not totally prompt, at least timely.
And I'm right there with you. And it's something I'd like to think I've improved upon a little bit. And it really wasn't until I started to really pay attention to the feedback I got, either from in the middle of the semester or from students at the end of the semester. And I realized, that's an achievable goal. When we've been talking about doing the 7 principles, and we'll of course link to some of our past episodes where we've talked about some of the other principles. But we would always go, prompt feedback. Yeah, we should do that episode.
we should do that one someday. It's like the procrastinators club in here.
It really was. So we were not very prompt about doing the episode on prompt feedback, which I think is kind of delicious in its own way. And part of the problem is, we were talking before we started recording, not really the problem, but part of the challenge in discussing this is there's the prompt part, but there's also what exactly constitutes feedback, and the one kind of relates to the other. So I'm not sure where we should begin with this, other than let's review a little bit about summative and formative feedback.
Yeah, well, we can, sure, we can talk about the feedback part first, and we can remind ourselves and anybody who's listening to this that there are 2 kinds of feedback. There's formative feedback and there's summative feedback. And formative feedback is feedback that you provide to students while they are in the midst of learning, and it helps them gain a new understanding. When we're, because I teach writing, I always think of it in terms of, that's the feedback I give them while they're working on their papers. Summative feedback that's the grade. That's what you get at the end. It's evaluative. It tells you how you did, as a student. And I think that we in higher education have seen for a while as one of our challenges, getting students not to be so focused on that summative feedback, but to pay more attention to the formative feedback that we're providing along the way. So that's just kind of a refresher for a pod episode, something else.
So does one need to be more prompt than the other?
Well, my sense is yes. My sense is that formative feedback really, really has to be prompt, because the whole purpose of feedback is to let students know how they're doing. And formative feedback, it's not going to do students any good to know how they did on their first draft after they've written their 4th draft.
Right.
They really need to know that before they write their second draft. So, and analogous situations in any discipline. So I think I actually am pretty good about prompt formative feedback. When my students are in the middle of a project, I am really dedicated to making sure that by the next time I see them, they have heard from me and they have some feedback. It's that summative feedback that I tend to procrastinate and put off. And that's where I have to really be hard on myself and say, okay, I have to have this back within a week or whatever. So because they are going to start the next project. And yes, in fact, the next project will go better if they have already had even summative feedback on this first project.
And that's where I'm so glad you said that, because that's where I kind of had that revelation of, oh yeah, this is part of the issue. I mean, yes, I'm busy. Yes, they're busy, but we really do need to kind of put a period on that last assignment before we really get them engaged in the next assignment. And when you're doing project-based learning, that can be a challenge. I mean, the daily stuff is a challenge too, let's face it. So I have students who are creating performances. They really need to have kind of that, I give them feedback along the way, because formative feedback is about learning what you don't know as much as what you do know, right? But you have to give them that kind of that put that exclamation mark on the end of it,
right?
So they can cognitively move on. I think,
yes,
to some
yeah,
extent.
yeah. I think that.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for that.
And I'm a procrastinator, as you well know, being also my supervisor here at CTLT.
We have a club,
and and we are doing our employee self-evaluations here this week too, aren't we? But
it's formative feedback.
It is formative. You're right. And one of my habits is that I have this desire to get things done completely before moving on to the next thing, and that's not always possible in our own work lives. We have to juggle a couple things at a time. But when it comes to learning, I think it's not that model doesn't necessarily translate as well.
Yeah.
I think, which is not to say students shouldn't be doing multiple things,
or that they aren't.
That
I mean,
they
not.
are.
They constantly are.
Yeah. But even within the same class, I talked about 3 different ongoing assignments last night that they have in the course I'm teaching this semester. So, okay, we're dancing around the prompt part. I feel though. So that's kind of an important foundation on what we're going to explore for the rest of today's episode. But when we're talking about prompt feedback, let's talk about what are some ways to give students that prompt, if not immediate feedback on what they're doing.
Although it could be.
Yeah.
It could be immediate. And as a matter of fact, we pretty consistently are giving immediate feedback. So when we're in class, and students are doing any sort of, quote, performance, unquote. So during a class discussion, we give prompt feedback when we respond to what they said as part of the discussion. Or better yet, when someone else in the class responds to what they said as part of the discussion. So that, we're all having feedback all the time on everything we say. So that's kind of a feedback really broadly.
It's a communication. It's a communication definition of feedback. That is part of the transactional
broadly
model
defined
of communication. Yeah.
But also I think we need to realize, and I think this might be a place that we as instructors can give ourselves a little break. We don't have to be the only source of feedback for our students.
Yes.
So it's possible, for example, for a student to complete a self-evaluation in the midst of a project or a paper or whatever, to sort of tell you how they think it's going and where they need help and what they're struggling with and what they're really proud of. All of that is good information that you can then pretty quickly react to and let them know, yeah, you're right. You're doing that really well. Or, oh, I can tell you're struggling with that. Let me give you a boost. Let me show you an approach that you might take. So, self-evaluation can be a form of feedback. Peer evaluation, which is something I think a lot of people shy away from because it's a little bit, because student default is to say, to their friend, who's also in the class, good job, smiley face, and that's not feedback. That's not helpful.
Right.
So I think the trick to peer response and peer feedback is to always structure that. And I think we've talked about that before. You know, providing some structure for that feedback. What kinds of things do you want them to respond to?
Right.
And model feedback. So they should be seeing in your feedback to them the kind of feedback that you want them to give each other.
Right.
Maybe providing a template, providing examples, having conversations in class about times that they've been helped by feedback, maybe from a coach, from a music teacher.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
You know, and so that they understand what it is that they're trying to do, and that, yes, it actually is. It's not helpful to my classmates if I just say good job, smiley face. It might save their feelings, but it won't save their grade.
Right.
So,
right. No, that's
you
true.
know, so it's more helpful if, in fact, you give them some sort of actionable feedback, something that they can move forward with.
And helping students to learn how to give feedback is actually a very valuable set of skills.
Oh my goodness, absolutely.
You know, and again, I'm only teaching one course a semester, so I have a limited set of examples to draw from. In the course that I teach, again, I do have a couple exercises where students have done a performance, and then part of the overall grade is for them to critique other students' performances.
Yes.
Now that had to be very much structured, and the feedback is anonymous. So in order to encourage students to be honest, so I'm not that that achieves the goals I have for the class. I don't know overall if that's necessarily.
I think a lot of people do that.
Yeah,
that's okay.
But
I think that the idea of teaching students to provide good feedback,
right,
and part of that may be including that good feedback as part of the assessment for the project. So, I'm going to grade your final product, but I'm also going to grade a part of that grade is going to include the feedback that you gave other people and whether or not that was helpful. So, and I think it's also important. I was talking about modeling earlier, to help students learn to give feedback respectfully and to make them understand, or to help them understand, that that's the expectation, that feedback is always respectful and given in respectful ways, and with the ultimate aim of helping somebody else learn. So, feedback, because feedback can be, as we both know, it can be destructive if it's delivered in the wrong way, or at the wrong time, or in the wrong fashion. That can be hurtful. So we want to make sure that students understand all the things that go into providing feedback.
It's interesting because I just realized this. Both you and I come from a background where, at various points in our lives, we've served the role of editor.
Yeah.
Which is a feedback.
For our sins.
Well, right, exactly. Well, in my case, talk about the Peter Principle, but that's a whole nother episode. No, but seriously, talking about, the best experience I had working with an editor, in a journalistic sense in my case, are editors who make suggestions instead of the Perry White sort of, hard-nosed, cigar-chomping editor.
Just making corrections and shouting people down.
Yeah, why don't you know how to spell? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which is an open question for me, but that's a whole other.
Well, and so here's another way to think about it. Many of us have experience providing feedback to authors of journal articles.
Right.
So we are reviewers for various journals, and I don't think everyone does this, but I always try to sort of have a positive demeanor in my reviews, even if what I'm saying is, this isn't ready.
Yeah.
Or it's not appropriate for this journal, or whatever. To offer some feedback that allows people to move forward. So, I try to respond to colleagues in the same way I would respond to students, but also to respond to students in the same way I would respond to colleagues, which is respectfully. And with the full knowledge that they're going to use this, or with the full hope, I guess I should say, that they're going to use this and move forward. So because you can really damage a relationship with a student, and I've done this, so I know that you can damage a relationship with a student with sort of ill-conceived feedback, even though you may mean it in a really positive way. So.
Yeah.
Don't want that to happen.
Or my experience.
We're going to scare people. Nobody's going to want to give.
No one's going to want to give feedback after this. Or in my experience, trying to be humorous.
Yeah.
And that didn't work either. That didn't land.
Whoops. Yeah.
Whoops. Yeah. And this is, I think that, though, to be totally honest, is another reason why it took us a while to get to this, because all of the things we've been talking about are things that I have said to myself, I don't want to deal with that right now. Because getting students to give each other feedback can seem like an onerous task, especially if you've never done it before or it's not very well structured. Mm-hmm. Going back to that idea of students giving themselves feedback, where do you see, and we haven't talked about this, where do you see the relationship between prompt student feedback and the idea of a study group? Because we've talked about study groups in past episodes.
I had never thought about that, but of course that's feedback. I mean, when they're working in groups to learn. Another thing that's feedback is, I was taking one of those BuzzFeed quizzes right on Facebook the other day,
okay.
and interestingly, it was like, how much do you know about teaching and learning? And one of the questions had to do with feedback. And one of the questions in the quiz had to do with what's a good way to study? And one of the answers, the correct answer was quiz yourself. And that, in fact, yes, that's a much better way to study than rereading the chapter or using a highlighter or even, creating comments in the margins. Quizzing yourself is a great way to learn because guess what? It's prompt feedback. Right away, you can look it up and find out, I got that answer wrong. So even though it's students doing it for themselves, it's fast and it's helpful. So because they know they've misunderstood or not learned something. So that's good.
That is good.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. That's a good way of looking at it. So when we're talking about prompt feedback, there are still going to be times we have some ideas now about how you can get students to give feedback to each other, or having feedback as part of to themselves, having feedback as part of a discussion in class. But there are still times when we as instructors just have to.
I know we can't. we
cannot
really can't pass it off to anybody else anymore.
So we can't end this episode without at least talking a little bit about maybe some techniques or some things to avoid, at least when we are. We always go back to planning the semester, but even if it's the middle of the semester now or a little bit thereafter, and we are and everything's piled up, what do you do?
Yeah. Well, I think I think the first thing is you prioritize. So you prioritize what is the most important thing I need students to learn from this feedback, and you really focus on that, and don't spend, focus your time, focus your attention on that. Don't spend hours and hours giving the kind of feedback that's not going to be helpful. So I, once again, because I always default to writing, right? So on an early draft, they hear nothing from me about their grammar and punctuation. I'm an English teacher. I had to train myself to do that. I had to actually, there were a few months where I sat on my hands while I was reading early drafts in order to keep from going in and editing the student work. That wasn't the most important thing for them to hear, right? To hear from me was, how's the paper going? Where do they need more evidence? Do they have a clear thesis? Are they on the right track? So, there were just really more important things to address.
Sure.
So I think that's one of the things that we need to remind ourselves. I think find a way of providing feedback that's comfortable for you. I tend to, I used to write it all out in longhand on their papers. I moved to writing it, composing at the computer so that now I can, take a document that they've submitted and I can, I'm going to use the word type. I type in my comments. I write my comments on the text. But there are other ways. So, for example, you can record your feedback. And I've never done this, but I do have colleagues who've done it successfully for years. And I understand that in ReggieNet, I can do it in ReggieNet. So, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, what, I can? You should call Charles.
Yeah. Go to our website, ctlt.illinoisstate.edu. Click on the big old ReggieNet logo. That will get you to the instructional support side of ReggieNet.
Yeah.
And then you can contact us from there. Yeah. I have not actually used it this semester in teaching, but I know that we've played around with the function a little bit. It works. You are limited to 180 seconds, so that's 3 minutes or something.
That's 3 minutes. That should be plenty.
So it forces you to be succinct. Oddly enough, for a broadcast performance class, I don't record audio feedback back to the student. And I have before, and one reason why, part of it's just I would rather type out my thoughts because I'm working off a rubric typically. Right. But even with their papers, I don't mark their papers. I don't return their papers anymore. And of course, I'm accepting all this electronically. I'm not doing markup in the paper because it's about the ideas that they're presenting, not necessarily how they formatted them and stuff for this course. But I do always put comments in ReggieNet when the assignment is returned, and there are bullet points about what's going on. And I always say with papers, if you want to get a little bit more detail, come in and see me. Right. Very rarely do they do that, I'll be honest. But
they will sometimes.
But I used to just correct their grammar because I think that when we get overwhelmed as instructors, sometimes we kind of go back to basics because it's the easiest thing to.
We go to where we're comfortable.
Yeah,
that's what we do when we're stressed. We go back to where we're comfortable, and that's an easy thing. Oh yeah, look, there should be a comma here.
Yeah.
But you mentioned rubrics, and that's another form of feedback, right? And it can be a time saving form of feedback, particularly when you get to that sort of summative point.
Right.
Where what I need to do now is evaluate and give a grade, and a rubric is a great time saving tool. And but it's not just about saving time; it's about providing useful feedback. And so a rubric really helps students see exactly where they went wrong in terms of the expectations for the assignment.
Right.
So it's quite communicative. I always with a rubric try to keep in mind that anything that's in the rubric is basically a rubber stamp response. And so all of my rubrics have room for individual comments.
And that's what I was talking about. Yeah.
And so I do try to make sure that nobody just gets back a rubric where I've checked off boxes or highlighted things or whatever, but that I write. But it saves me time. I can give a more personal response because I've taken care of all those rubber stamp things in the rubric.
Right.
So I feel like then I can use that extra piece to make a connection with the student.
And I think in any assignment, especially maybe in the assignments that you or I would be looking at, given our disciplines, there's an awful lot of subjectivity, and a rubric is a way not to eliminate that, but to at least communicate it, like you said, a little bit more, maybe to objectify it a little bit in an agreed upon language, because the students always, of course, have the rubric before the assignment is given, or before they do the assignment, so they kind of know what the expectations are and stuff like that. We've talked a little bit about this before, but I want to kind of summarize our discussion of prompt feedback today, to talk a little bit about the dialogue with students about setting expectations on when should they expect to get feedback.
Yes.
And especially that summative feedback that we're talking about. Yeah. Because I've had some consultations with faculty members, and I've done this myself, and I still catch myself doing it, saying, yeah, I should have that back to you next week. No, I didn't have that back to them next week. And that really creates, I think, some angst, especially because students are kind of used to that. They want, like you said,
they gear themselves up for getting it back, and then they don't get it, and it's like a letdown.
Yeah, even with the best of feedback, and if they are really focused just on that grade, and we haven't yet reached the point where they're thinking more about the learning behind the grade, then that exacerbates the situation even more. So, any advice on?
Well, I think it's important to let students know the time frame in which they can expect. So I once made myself wildly unpopular
I think we talked about this once.
Did we
yeah,
talk
but,
about that?
But it's worth telling again.
In the writing program by putting a note in the standard syllabus for English 101 that instructors would always return graded work within 10 days or something like that.
Right,
and boy, did I get a lot of graduate students really angry at me.
Got a lot of feedback, didn't you?
I got a lot of promptly, yes. But I think setting a reasonable expectation, in part because students' expectation seems to be that all feedback will be immediate.
Right.
I think in this digital age, they're so used to getting immediate, and right. I mean by immediate, I mean within, you put something on Facebook and if you don't start getting likes within a couple of minutes, right. You start to wonder, did that really post? Why aren't my friends, liking this? Or
if you text someone on your phone, you're expecting an immediate response.
That's
in fact,
right.
I had a student say to me a couple days ago, well, I texted him, but I didn't even get a delivered receipt. And I'm like, oh, are you getting those? Like you're making sure it's even delivered, so you have no excuse not to see it because our phones. And I think that's also true, by the way, which is a whole other episode talking about communication between instructors and students.
Right.
They expect those emails answered right away.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So students are expecting truly immediate feedback, and that's just not, that's not possible. Mm-hmm. When you're giving a test or you're grading a paper or you're reading a lab report or you're watching a performance or whatever. So, I think it's important to sort of define prompt in your syllabus and to say, unless you hear otherwise from me, you can anticipate that I will return your work within X amount of time. And then, if that's not going to be possible, because your kid breaks his leg or, something happens.
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah. Then you tell the students, you say, I was as fast as you can.
Yeah.
I was anticipating that I would have these back for you next class period, send
right.
out an email, whatever.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen. I should be able to get them done by X. So I think, an ongoing conversation about when they're going to get their work back.
But you can't do that too many times, I think, is the other aspect
right.
of it. You can't make it the norm that every
class
period starts with. Even
an excuse.
Even though I like having a little housekeeping time in a class, but you can't set up that the expectation is that you're going to come and make it the excuse du jour.
Right. Right. So, no, you have to.
Yeah.
You have to be respectful of their need for feedback
right.
and responsible in your role as their instructor and the person who's responsible for their learning. Mm-hmm. And you have to give them feedback in a timely fashion.
Yeah, I know, and it sounds so simple to say that, but it is.
Yeah, it's so hard.
The last thing I would probably want to leave folks with who are listening, because prompt feedback is so important, then if you're semester after semester, if you have some assignments, some assessments you're doing, whatever you want to call them, if there are parts of lessons that you are constantly struggling with to give prompt feedback, then maybe it's time to reevaluate how you're doing those lessons, because if the payoff isn't there in the end, then are you sure they're actually learning from them? And that's something that we can consult with instructors here. We're happy to do that here at CTLT. And take a look at what you're doing and maybe give you some advice on maybe different ways of assessing or of doing the same exercise.
That's a great idea.
All right, Claire. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
And that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Let's Talk Teaching. You can go to our website at ctlt.illinoisstate.edu. Click on the podcast link in the upper right of the page. You can find today's show notes. We'll link to the original study that the 7 principles are all based on and some of our past episodes and some other useful material. You can also find out how to subscribe to the show so you don't miss an episode. Until we talk again, happy teaching.